Stefan, what impact do you see the coronavirus having on the global economy?
Well, it can't be good, but it's way too early to tell, because it all depends on whether this lasts a long time or if it's something that passes fairly soon.
The Swedish economy is an industrial economy. It has exposure to China. What is your sense when you talk to some of the companies that operate within your country and talk to the industries that operate there as well? What are they seeing in terms of supply chain disruption?
Well, so far not much has happened, but eventually at the end of the day, it depends on for how long factories will be closed in China and to what extent goods has been on its way before that or not. So it's something which is pretty high on the radar screen, but so far, as far as we can judge, there has been no major impact. So it's more something that people are discussing. That's something that has already happened.
One impact that is already occurring is that we are seeing reduced prices for energy. Oil prices have come down reasonably significantly as a result of this. Do you, again, see this as a temporary phenomenon, or do you see it as being too early to call?
Well, we do think it's a temporary phenomenon, and in our environment, what actually happens at present, at least, to be more important than the oil price is what happens to the electricity price. And that's because the climate issues have been such lately that we've had a lot of wind. And that means that lately the electricity price has actually gone negative for a short while. And that means that on the inflationary side, inflation is coming in a little bit lower than what we expected.
Okay. Again, are you prepared to look through that? You raised rates to zero back in December. How high is the bar to taking them into negative territory again if that inflation or lack of inflation continues to persist?
Well, negative or not in the future, time will tell. But we're certainly prepared to see through the low electricity price, because we have lived with that for many years, and once in a while you have a spike in the electricity price, and once in a while, as happened the other day, it turns negative. So that's just the nature of the business, and we can't really base monetary policy on the next weather report.
Sure, I understand that, but what you can base it on is expectations for future inflation. Do you see inflation picking up to such a point that you can maintain rates at zero, or do you think the gravitational pull of negative rates still remains?
No, I mean, in terms of our inflation projection, what we expect will happen here is that eventually the electricity price effect peters out, and that means that a couple of years ahead we see inflation again rising up towards 2%, which is our goal.
What do you see about what is happening with the euro at the moment? Your currency is going up against the euro. In fact, a lot of currencies are going up against the euro. The euro is declining. What factor is that going to have in terms of your thinking about where monetary policy is going to go from here? Clearly, the eurozone is your biggest trading partner and again, therefore exerts a disproportionate effect.
Well, I really don't want to pass judgment on the euro as such. I just take note of the fact that many times in the past, the krona has actually depreciated when we expected the krona to appreciate. And this holds this time as well. So in terms of looking into the future, we actually expect the krona to slowly appreciate. And that is what has been factored into our projections. So that's not a major issue as of now.
Why do you think it is, and we've seen this in a number of countries recently, that weak currencies don't seem to have the effect that you would expect when you look at the theory, economic theory? Why are super cheap currencies not having the impact that they once did?
Well, our impression is certainly in the Swedish economy that the pass-through is lower today than, let's say, in the 90s when we left the peg, because back in those days people constantly talked about the pass-through. Now the krona can actually fluctuate quite a lot up and down. It doesn't really seem to affect inflation all that much in in the short run. So my impression is that people have simply gotten used to the idea that you can have quite a volatile exchange rate, and somehow that does not translate into higher or lower prices domestically. You just live with it. And part of it is also probably coming from the fact that we have more complicated value chains today compared to, let's say, 10 or 20 years ago. And that means that some of the exports that we have, they just sort of bounce by the Swedish economy, so to speak, because we import stuff, we add something and then export back again. And then, of course, in that environment, the exchange rate does not have the same effect that it would have had, let's say, 10 years ago or 20 years ago when we exported more raw materials and less services.
Can I ask you about monetary policy more broadly and get your take on the kind of future direction of travel, not just for you, but potentially for others? There is a very big debate about the effectiveness of negative rates. You have raised back to zero. You've clearly made a statement on that. But what is your assessment of where monetary policy goes from here? If it isn't back into negative territory, what are the other options that are on the table right now?
Well, we have never said that we ever will go negative again. If there is a need to do that, then we certainly would be willing to do that. But having said that, I also think that let's say, just for the sake of the argument, going all the way down to -5 or any other sort of high number is probably not in the cards, because then it would be pretty hard to understand how the economy would operate under those circumstances. So essentially, going slightly negative is probably perfectly fine. But beyond that, with a higher likelihood, we're really talking about using our balance sheet in one way or the other. That's essentially money creation.
Do you think that the baton has now been passed to the fiscal authorities? Do you think monetary policy has reached maybe some of the limits of what is achievable and effective, and therefore actually fiscal policy is now probably needing to do more heavy lifting?
Well, not at the present juncture when it comes to our projections, because we actually expect growth to be for the coming years between 1% to 2%. Which is pretty okay. So in terms of the economy, the Swedish economy at least, we don't foresee a serious downturn. But if major things were to happen on the negative side in the global economy, or domestically for that matter, despite our projections, then in that environment, I'm pretty sure that we would end up with a conversation about the proper policy mix, because under those circumstances, under very adverse circumstances, you would need to find methods of increasing aggregate demand in the economy in one form or the other. And that's essentially about putting money in the hands of those people who are actually willing to spend the money. And that, of course, raises the issue who can engineer that in an efficient way. Either you do it via monetary policy, then in our environment that would be essentially lowering the policy rate, and that would jack up borrowing among households. They already have too much debt. The other alternative would be to do things on the fiscal side, and on the fiscal side, under very adverse conditions, we probably, compared to many other countries, have ample fiscal space. So that's certainly a conversation that would be worthwhile to have down the road. But as I said, it's not something that we foresee in the near future at all. It's a completely different conversation if we start talking fine-tuning around a policy rate of zero, because that's a different conversation. And I don't foresee very much on the fiscal side, neither on the fiscal side nor on the monetary policy side for the coming years, given our projections.
Stefan Ingves, thank you very much indeed for your time. We greatly appreciate it.